So thank you everyone for joining ISMTE 2021 Global Event for the session on citations and linking research outputs. My name is Mate Palfi. I work as a reviews editor for Journal of Science and volunteer for ISMTE on the European Programming Committee. Just a short housekeeping. So we're going to hold questions until after the presentations have finished, but please submit your questions anytime during the presentation by using the Q&A field. Also, feel free to indicate which presenter you're asking by typing an @ before the presenter's name. And you can also upvote questions from other attendees you find interesting. And we'll try to do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So before we get started, of course, a big thanks goes to our sponsors. And so this leads me to just again introducing the speakers in the session. So in this panel, we will cover new tools and approaches that allow publishers to capture discussions and information about research beyond citations. For example, to track the impact of published research. And we'll also hear about a new tool that adds a qualitative nature to citations. Joining us are Josh Nicholson, Martin Rittman, and Tyler Roos. So Josh is a co-founder and CEO of Cite. He holds a PhD from Virginia Tech and was previously founder of the Winnoware and CEO of Authoria, two companies aimed at improving how scientists publish and collaborate. Martin is a former publisher and researcher who is currently a product manager at Crossref. Topics falling in his area of responsibility include event data, which we'll hear more about today during his talk. And he also deals with all things preprints and citation tracking. And Tyler Roos is Director of Publisher Solutions at Digital Science. He joined Digital Science in 2017 and spends most of his time helping publishers get business value out of data-focused products. Tyler has been working with publishers of all kinds for more than 20 years and has held leadership and technology roles at R.R. Donnelley, Libra Digital, Ingram Content Group, and OCLC. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Josh. So Josh, the stage is yours. I'll just
Thank you.
My slides.
Give me 1 second to grab my file. Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. So my name is Josh, and as Mate mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cite. My email address is below, and as well as our Twitter. If you have any questions or feedback after the session that you think of later, please feel free to email us or tweet at us. And so today, I generally always like to kind of start, by acknowledging that what we do, is amazing. I think we get very bogged down in kind of the nitty gritty of impact factors. Editors, are often lamented by researchers, but behind publishing, behind research, behind peer review is, really amazing things that we output. And so the ability to have this virtual conference, now life-saving vaccines, and this slide is, I made pre-COVID-19 vaccines, the powerful computer in your phone, all these things were informed by scientific research. They connect across time and space. And I think it's something that, we should take a step back from sometimes and appreciate, because it's easy to get lost in kind of our day-to-day challenges. At the same time, it's not perfect. And so there's a lot of content. And so there's a massive amount of information being produced. If you look at biomedical literature alone, there's about 2 papers per minute coming out. This is likely an underestimate at this point because that comes years ago. And then if you try to reproduce studies in certain fields, more often than not, you can't. And so there's challenges. How do we identify what is reliable? How do we better understand research? How do we keep up to date with this amazing content so that we can utilize it? And that's really the aim of Cite, is that we built Cite to make research more reliable, more understandable, more interpretable, so that all those amazing things that are coming out can better be utilized. And so Cite is really trying to bring in the next generation of citations. To do this, we take full text publications, PDF or XML, from publishers as well as open access sources. And then we use a lot of machine learning to extract out citation statements. And then we classify them as, do they provide supporting evidence, contrasting evidence? Do they come from the results section, the discussion section, so on and so forth? And so we're really trying to change the conversation from how many times has an article been cited to how has it been cited. So showing the conversation that's happening amongst papers. And to date, we have now analyzed 26 million full text articles and extracted and analyzed almost 910 million citation statements. This applies to 40 million different articles that you can see how research has been cited. And so the way that I like to show cite is to show the world as it exists without cite, and then to show it through the lens of cite. And so here is, an article that I pulled from Elsevier. Generally, when you look at, a research paper, you look at where is it published? Do I know this journal? Does it have a high impact factor? And then the same questions generally apply to the authors and their affiliations. Are they from institutions that I know, that I trust? Do I know any of the researchers and their reputations? And then we look at some metrics. So the number of citations, the number of tweets, the number of shares, downloads, reads, things like this. And I would say this metric area is often utilized very superficially. So we look at, does this have a high altmetrics score? Does this have a high tweet score? And oftentimes we don't dig into what's behind that because it's a massive amount of work, right? So if you look at, a traditional citation index and look at 52 cited papers, you're going to see 52 titles. Maybe you'll open 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but in general, you're not going to systematically open up 52 articles to see what they say about this research paper. And that is, understandable. It's also what we think is, a missed opportunity, because behind those 52 citations is relevant information. Maybe there's some papers that provide important nuance and context and help you better understand what you're reading, expert really kind of analysis of this. Maybe some of those papers have looked at the same claim from the article of interest, and maybe they either support it or they provide, contrasting evidence to it. And so this information we're trying to surface and make more digestible by showing how an article has been cited, by showing the in-text citation of the context. And so if you click on our browser extension, which you might have seen on that last screenshot, it'll bring you over to Cite. And the key, differentiator from Cite and really other tools is that we show this in-text citation. So these 3 sentences coming from the full text. Not only do we make it easy for you to read this, we also show you where it comes from. So this is coming from the discussion section of this article. And then we provide a citation type indicating whether this the citing statement is saying that they support it with evidence or that they contrast it with evidence. And so this allows you to generally come up to speed really quickly and see how has an article been received in the literature. And it's not just about supporting or contrasting citations. Really, I would emphasize that where a citation appears in the citing article can have very important implications. So, sorting by discussion citations as well as result citations can really help you to understand an article. And we have a lot of students, including undergraduate students, using Cite for this reason, because I think it's a way to look at what have experts said about this article that I'm reading, how have they interpreted it, and what can I learn from that? And so beyond just looking at individual articles, Cite has been very useful for research and where there's a lot of preprints coming out, and these are often being amplified to large audiences. And so on the left is a newspaper article looking at COVID linked to risk of mental illness. This came out in a medRxiv preprint, was massively amplified, so a very high altmetric score, and was later subsequently by another preprint shown to be challenged. And so this is something that I think we're really kind of dealing with in our personal lives as well as our professional lives, is this massive amount of information that's being amplified by different sources that impacts really our day-to-day lives, our loved ones. How do we keep up with that? And so, Cite is hoping to help with this by showing, not only how papers have been cited, but also how preprints have been cited. And of course, this relies upon, this preprint having to have been cited. And so, if this new preprint came out, there wouldn't have been any information necessarily to it. And so we might not have helped there. And so we've just introduced something that can actually help, look at claims. So not just how papers have been cited, people have been cited, or journals, but what about claims? And so here is a tweet from September 29th that has, again, had a massive outreach. So there's 779 retweets. There's probably more at this point, 199 quote tweets looking at this tweet from Eric Topol, the head of Medscape. And he's putting forward, a preprint that makes a pretty big claim, looking that there's no significant differences in viral load between vaccinated and unvaccinated, asymptomatic and symptomatic groups infected with COVID-19. And so what I did when I looked at this was to really utilize Cite kind of in a personal capacity. And so I just previously showed you how you can check if an article has been cited, but what about this new preprint that has yet to be cited as it just came out? And so we've introduced a new tool that allows you to search our citation statements to see what have others said about this claim that is being made. And so you can highlight anywhere you're reading, whether that's an individual word or a phrase, using our browser extension to search these citation statements. And so this is a screenshot of highlighting this and then right-clicking search citation statements. And what this allows you to do is to basically ask the literature a question and see what have expert analyses backed by data, backed by peer review, tied to a permanent record. What have they said about different things of interest? And this is it's fun because the research literature is so diverse. So that you can search, how does Peppa Pig influence your children, to how does prostate cancer is affected by this drug or disease. And so what I did, and this is a real life scenario, was to highlight that and search it. And immediately I found one paper that shows there is a difference if you look at vaccinated healthcare workers and unvaccinated healthcare workers in the viral culture of this. So using another technique, you actually do see a difference between this. And not only do you find this article, which again is a preprint, you also see that it's been supported. So you can click on that supporting citation statement. And so within a matter of minutes, we found 2 different papers that have gone against this big claim. And sure enough, they're not actually cited in the preprint. And so I think this is a way that will start to really help people get through the literature to understand the different sides, the complexity of everything, and to better utilize that information that's out there beyond a simple count. So taking the next step, and I think relevant to this audience, how can we kind of make sure that what we're publishing or what we're citing is reliable, and how can we see how others have cited it? And so to highlight this last feature, this reference check, I show an article from Frontiers in Psychology, so apologies if there's any Frontiers editors in the audience. And this is a paper that was published in November 2020. We have built this reference check that allows you to upload a published document, but it's been designed for an unpublished document, and it's been integrated into major submission systems like Editorial Manager, Manuscript Manager. We've partnered with ScholarOne. It's not yet live there, as well as EJP is being built in. And what this allows you to do is to take an unpublished manuscript to look at the references and say, are these sound? And so if you look at that Frontiers article, we are able to detect 39 references in that paper. There may be some more if there's a newspaper and things like that. We are not working with that. But what you can see is now here's those references. You can see how they've been cited in the literature. So this top one has actually been retracted. And so they're citing an article that was published in 2004, was actually retracted in 2013. So this is a paper that has been retracted for 7 years and is being cited as reliable. And if this was a live demo, I'd expand this so you can see how they've cited it. That is pretty clear cut that shouldn't happen. You shouldn't be citing work that's retracted and fraudulent. The other cases are more granular and more context dependent. And so if you scroll down, this one has 2 citation statements that are contrasting. It also has supporting citation statements. This doesn't mean you should remove this or not use it, but I think that extra nuance and interpretation and context is extremely valuable for authors that might have spent years doing this research and months or years writing this up, as well as editors and peer reviewers. I also think, and this is not what the tool is designed for, it's a way to kind of find relevant reviewers by looking at who else has cited this work. And so that is something that we've now just started to deploy into major submission systems, and I think can really help this audience. And so I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this idea we thought was entirely our own, but it's been talked about for a long time. And so here is Eugene Garfield back in 1964 talking about citation markers and suggesting that these markers should appear in the published citation index along with the usual citation data. And he gives some examples such as critiquing citation, Mr. X is wrong citation, or my favorite, calamities for mankind citation. And so we are fortunate enough to be doing what we're doing when Crossref exists, where you can utilize that metadata, where there's enough open access articles to where we can get started. And then there's enough cooperation publishers to where we can gain access to content behind paywalls. And so that's a whirlwind of kind of everything I've showed to you. And so hopefully there's questions at the end of this. And I would say thanks for waking up early if you're waking up early, and thanks for joining otherwise. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Really amazing talk. I saw some flying thumbs up emojis during your presentation, so I think the audience also really liked it. So next up is Martin. So if you could share your screen and give your talk.
Yep. Right. So yeah, you should be able to see my screen now. Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to present here. It's great to be part of this session. Yeah, I'm a product manager at Crossref, and I'm guessing most of the audience are familiar with Crossref as a DOI registration agency. This is what we put on our website, that we make research outputs easy to find, link, cite, assess, and reuse. I'm going to talk today a bit about event data, and with event data, we're really focusing on the link and assess parts of this mission statement. So what is event data? Well, event data is where we look around the internet to find out where people have mentioned the research associated with our DOIs. So that's whether they use the DOI directly or whether they're using a URL with the publisher domain in, so like, wiley.com or plos.org or, whatever else. So we have a number of sources that we monitor. We have software called agents that check these sources. They're looking out for the text that contains DOIs or URLs with DOIs or publisher domains in. When they see something interesting, they pass that along to a kind of processing piece of software called the percolator, and that says, okay, can we link this URL or this bit of text with a DOI? And if we can, great, we create an event and we stick that in our public event data API. The bottom, you can also see this, we get metadata from Crossref, obviously, and also DataCite, which is, DOI registration agency for data sets. So that's the basic process. What does an event itself look like? Well, on the left here, we have the kind of skeleton of an event. This is the most important bits of information that we have. So there's a subject, which is something like a tweet or a Wikipedia page or a URL to a newspaper article online. We have an object, which is typically a Crossref DOI. And then we have either a single word or a short statement, such as references or cited by cites or is version of, that describes the relationship between the subject and the object. We cover a number of sources at the moment. I'll mention a bit later that we're looking to expand these sources. We get different. I mean, at the moment we're getting a range of different kinds of data. So we have data that has DOIs, has identifiers. We're getting annotations through Hypothesis, some social media through Reddit and Twitter. We look at Wikipedia as well, and there's various sites that we look at, on WordPress or through RSS feeds. So we're getting a range of different kinds of data coming into event data. So if you want to get your hands on it, how do you go about that? I'll say first up that we don't provide something like a widget or a plugin or a dashboard to get the data. We're about providing open data, and you can do with it what you want. And you can access it via an API. So this is the kind of base URL for the API. You can specify the number of results that you want, up to 1,000. We very much encourage you to be polite, include your email address. That helps us to contact you if there's a problem or troubleshoot if you're having difficulties, or if you start hammering like crazy, then we can email you instead of just blocking you directly. And then there's a number of filters that you can apply. So this is just one example here. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all of the filters that we provide, but this one will return everything, all of the events that have been made with this prefix. You can query individual DOIs, time, periods of time, specific sources, and so on. And there's a kind of full description in our user guide. The link is here, and I think we can share slides afterwards, I guess. There's also a few examples of how you can use event data in Jupyter notebooks. You can run, if you go to this link, then you can run them online. You don't have to install anything. If you're not familiar with Jupyter notebooks, they're Python based, but you can run the notebooks here, you can run online without having to install anything. This is what the output looks like. So there's really two sections to the output. There's the header, which tells you how many, whether the query was successful, how many results there were. I'm guessing this is probably a little bit difficult to read, but the output is in JSON format. It's a fairly standard format. And then along with the header, we have the event list. And each event has the subject-object relationship triple that I mentioned earlier. There's a few extra bits of information about the subject and the object. We don't include full bibliographic data, so you won't find things like the title, the authors, the abstract in event data. We keep it very light, but you can query our metadata API if you need to get that information. There's a few bits of information about the source, including a link to the evidence record. Now, the evidence record is a log of the process that I described with the percolator. How did we decide that this is an event? How did we get to this chunk of text to a DOI and say, yeah, this website really mentions this DOI? And there's timestamps as well. There's the date that we added something to event data, and there's our best guess at when we think that that link or that event actually occurred, which depends on the source and is as accurate as we can make it. So just a few numbers around event data. We're coming up towards 750 million events since we launched in 2016. We're adding around 10 million new events per month. We've got 12 agents that are covering the sources that I mentioned earlier. And as I said, we're looking to increase that range of sources. I see there's a question from Richard Wynn. Hi, Richard, about whether we will cover PubPeer. It's something we're considering. At the moment, we're doing an evaluation of a number of different sources, and then later this year, maybe early next year, we'll be going out to the community, talking to our members to say, okay, which sources are you most interested in? Which can we work on? Should we be working on first? Because there's a lot of sources out there, and some of them are more useful to members than others. And we just want to evaluate that alongside the different use cases. So why should you bother with event data? So event data is about finding context around research. You can ask questions like, who's looking at the published outputs that I have? What are the topics or papers that are getting a lot of attention outside the typical citation regime? Where is research being picked up and reused? Both within, within, for example, data citation or citation within the academic community, but also in maybe non-standard or non-academic venues. You can look from the source side. You can say, okay, well, on Twitter, for example, what's getting the most attention? Are there certain articles of mine or of my competitors even that are getting attention? And you can also ask the question, this is something we're seeking to develop a little bit more, how do different research outputs fit together? So we work very closely with DataCite to add data citations into event data. Over the last few months, we've been kind of rethinking event data a little bit. And an event is, as I put here, an event is something that happens at one point in time. So Wikipedia citation, for example, someone cites something on Wikipedia, but then the page may get edited and maybe the citation gets dropped. In our current way of representing events, we don't have a way to represent the disappearance of an event very well. And it can also happen, for example, Crossref sees that an article cites a data set and creates an event. DataCite may see that the data set is cited by a research article and creates an event. Those things are effectively two views of the same thing. And it's not very obvious in our current setup how those things are linked, or even if they are identical. So what we are thinking and working on is shifting from a focus on these single observations to putting relationships at the center. And then you can, for example, query a DOI and get all of the relationships that this DOI has, along with a count of the observations and a list of the observations. So you can ask questions like, when was this first seen? Was it maybe seen in the past, but the relationship doesn't exist anymore because it's been removed? How many times has it been reobserved since it was first observed as well? And also add in data, metadata about who asserted or who's seen this relationship to exist at what point in time. And maybe you think some of the asserting authorities are more reliable than others. So we think this gives us some more opportunities. As I mentioned, we are working currently on reassessing the sources that we have. And it would be great to have feedback about whether there's sources like PubPeer that you'd be really interested to see within event data and what they would enable you to do. And we're also working on prototyping a relationship API, which for us is kind of the next iteration, the next generation of event data. And I'd be also curious to know whether you think the concept of a relationship, looking at relationships, is clearer than looking at single events. So any feedback on that would be great. And you can feel free to contact me. Details are there. Great. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for joining the session.
Thanks a lot, Martin. So I'll hand it over then now to Tyler.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and share. Okay, great. Everything good here? I've already had a great introduction, but I will just say that I'm joining you today from Boulder, Colorado, in the western part of the U.S. So it's still dark here, as you can see, sort of at the windows behind me. But it's really great to be here. So thanks everyone for joining today's presentation. I talked a little bit, or my title of my slides is about beyond citations, but what I really wanted to do is sort of look at impact in general, sort of more widely. And I wanted to sort of think about how I defined that. So the lens I use for today's talk is about is similar to something that the REF described in 2014. That's the Research Excellence Framework. And it really defines impact as sort of the effect or change or even benefit across the board in terms of economy, society, culture, public policy, services, health, environment, quality of life, and basically anything beyond academia that comes out of the benefit of the research. So that's sort of the lens I'm looking at today. So beyond citations, if you will. And the way that we have really sort of framed that out in the Dimensions platform, which is part of Digital Science, is really thinking about that, sort of thinking about this really, really broad view of research impact. So thinking about everything from the origination of the research grant through the research life cycle, and then, of course, into all of the outputs, including things like publications and supplementary data that goes along with that. But then starting to track then what happens after that activity. Things like short-term impact, like altmetrics, and things like tweets, mentions in blogs or Wikipedia articles, et cetera. And then traditional citations, but then thinking even further beyond that, what is the impact of things like clinical trials or patents or policy documents, really sort of further downstream. And so that's really sort of the genesis of what we wanted to do with Dimensions, is really sort of paint the picture of that landscape. And to do that, we really had to sort of break apart all of those different individual document types, build a metadata sort of data model around those so that we could really house those in one super database, and then really explore all the links between all of those. So really trying to understand the links between research and then the resulting publication, and then of course all of those different areas of impact downstream that we could potentially measure. And it really came down to sort of thinking about what kinds of indicators we could then sort of surface from all of that work that we did, all of the sort of data analysis that we did there. So everything from traditional citations to altmetrics that we mentioned, but then also were there citations from clinical trials? Were there citations and patents? Were there potential impact to policy downstream? And then of course more traditional calculations, things like the field citation ratio, relative citation ratio, H-index, those kinds of things are really everything that you can sort of bundle together and say, here's a whole sort of library of different indicators of impact that might be of interest to you, going beyond sort of one sort of proprietary definition and sort of thinking about, what are the different tools and different indicators that are available to you. So we'll start a little bit just talking about traditional citations here. We really wanted to make citations data open and accessible. We wanted to include coverage of traditional citations along with altmetrics. So we've got some cool badging that goes along with that to enable the sort of quick and easy access to understand sort of citations and timing around citations, and then of course the breakdown of any sort of altmetric attention that's been applied to a particular publication. We do, again, try to make that as open and as accessible as possible. So as you click through some of the badging that we've built, you really do get access to some narrative about the citation data, understanding what's the recency around that citation, some algorithms around comparing that to other articles in the same field, other articles in the same sort of time band, and then looking at things like citations over time. So looking at what year did that citation get applied. And then, of course, looking at interesting things like looking at the research categories that the citing articles were categorized against. So were the citations actually coming from papers in the same subject area, or were they coming from other subject areas? And then we started to look at like what different lenses we could really surface those indicators. So the first one I'll talk about is through the publication lens. So looking at an individual publication and its really, really broad impact. So did a specific publication have a certain number of citations, an altmetric attention score, but then also did it have patents that cited it? Did it have clinical trials that linked to it? Did it have policy documents that mentioned it really, really further downstream? And then, of course, was there supplementary data provided alongside of that that includes citations to the supplementary data as well? So thinking about that entire universe of what the publication output and the actual output from the research might look like, and what impact that has as well, going beyond just the publication. And then the next lens we wanted to look at was through the research institution. So thinking about research as a whole, how could you look at this data, these indicators through the research institution and sort of understand how many, how much output from a particular research institution generated some of this impact? Did it generate a significant amount of patent citations, and where were those assignees located? And then also the same sort of view in terms of clinical trials or policy documents, sort of really in an aggregate, when you look at a research institution, how do you really understand their really long-term impact going beyond just looking at specific citation data? And then, of course, you can look through the author lens. So one thing we're able to do is really chart an author's career over time and understand not only the genesis of their research funding, who funded it, what their institutional affiliation was at the time, but then how many publications did they publish based on the science and research that they did, and then how many citations have those received, and of course, going beyond that, how many different patents might have cited that, or how many clinical trials or how many policy documents might have used their research downstream to really sort of increase the longevity of the impact of that research as well. And then one really cool sort of thing that we wanted to look at was going beyond some of those even sort of more documentable types of impact was, how do you measure the success or the impact of research against other types of metrics? So in this case, we're looking at the overall number of publications from a research institution that are mapped against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So doing a lot of work around being able to categorize all of those individual publications and their output, and then really being able to report back at an aggregate level, how did they map up against something like the UN SDGs, which is really important and interesting to look at on an individual basis, but then, of course, as an aggregate as well. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the time today. I think we're going to turn it back over for some Q&A, but really appreciate it and hope everybody else has a great rest of their event today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tyler. So I invite the audience to please post your question in the Q&A. And so while the questions are coming in, maybe I start with a more general question to all three of the panelists. So I fully agree with Tyler that we should look more broadly at research impact, but often funding agencies might look just at a small number of metrics, like just a number of citations or impact factor. And I'm wondering what you think can be done in terms of like engagement so that this changes, so that researchers start using these more sophisticated kind of metrics of what impact is. So maybe if I could first get Tyler, but I'm also curious to hear what Josh and Martin thinks about how we can change this.
Well, I'll say with number one is making the data available, right? Is really being able to surface that data, and there's a number of different initiatives that are underway that really make it more visible and more accessible. And then, of course, as long as we get that into the sort of research or workflow, I think that would be the sort of mechanics of how to really get that going. And then I think, I just think by nature that you'll start to get some adoption, et cetera. But really, it's about making the data available. We're now currently, I think it's either buried or inaccessible or sort of hard to get to. Let's make it really surfaced well and in a researcher workflow rather than in other platforms or in other places they have to go.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think I think even if it's perfectly accessible and easy, it just takes time for some of these things, and so it needs to be understandable, accessible, and I think that's starting to happen. And I think the other thing about it is the people that are sometimes using or abusing some of these metrics, it needs to be really easy, right? And so I think a lot of these sophisticated things it might seem really easy, but might go over people's heads, and so I think that's why we often have pretty simplistic counts looking at these things to say this is how many we have of those, because people can understand it, and so that's a challenge of making it understandable as well as accessible.
Yeah, I would say I think the technological side of doing this, which is probably what our expertise in is actually relatively simple. Having kind of social change and that takes a lot more time generally. I know there's progress in, I think, the Netherlands to look at different ways of assessing researchers and see whether you can do it without metrics or with a little bit more subtlety. And you can't abandon metrics altogether, I think, but you need to use them to inform to inform a more broad approach, I think. And echo what the other two have said about getting the data out there is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And there's a question to you in the Q&A from Rachel Anderson. So she's asking if you can provide an example of an event relationship you refer to, so a concrete example.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry, I probably rushed the slides a little bit towards the end. So, I mean, you can deposit relationships with Crossref metadata at the moment, and that's something like you can say that a research article is or cites a data set, for example, or you can also have gene identifiers. For example, you can say that this uses a gene identifier. With event data, the types of relationships are a little bit broader. So you may have something like a hypothesis annotation annotates a research article. And it's this word in the middle, a kind of annotates reference is referenced by. These are the relationships. And it may be that the same relationship is viewed by different sources or different platforms in a slightly different way, but they're all observing the same link between two online objects, essentially.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And so you mentioned during your talk also that Crossref doesn't offer a dashboard or plugin. Is there any plan to do this in the future, or are you planning to partner with third parties to do this? Because I imagine for a lot of this audience, it could be helpful to have something more easy than an API. Yeah.
I mean, there are third parties who have picked up Crossref data, and Paperbuzz is one of those, which does a kind of open source plugin, which is kind of similar to Altmetric. And there's I know our research pick up event data and do things with it, which isn't directly for use by publishers, but I know there's also one or two platform providers are using Crossref metadata. So if you don't think you've got the technical skills yourself, you might want to get in touch with your platform provider and say, hey, would you be interested in building something on top of Crossref event data? yeah, we don't plan to do anything directly with event data that's a kind of a plugin like a donut or a bagel or a sandwich or something.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, we're still waiting for some more questions. I don't know if you have any questions to each other, or I can, I have a couple I can ask. So Josh, I mean, you didn't cover this in your talk, but so you also posted a preprint earlier this year, and I think I read there that actually only like a small fraction of citations are supporting or disputing. So most of them are actually just mentioning. And so you mentioned some very nice specific examples also with COVID. I was just wondering if you've noticed any patterns of whether there are fields where there's more supporting or disputing citations, or if there's anyone looking into these kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I think it's important first to kind of emphasize, what is a supporting or a contrasting citation? And so it's not just about positive or negative sentiment. And so people, when they first hear about cite, always search themselves if they've published before, and then they search, a paper they know to be bad. And oftentimes they go to the Wakefield study and they say, oh, the tool is maybe not working because there's 1,000 citations, but there's only 12 or so contrasting. And the thing is, we're not just looking at, is this critical of, or are they saying something, negative about it? It's really the rhetorical function, is there supporting or contrasting evidence? And if you think of it from that perspective, it makes sense that there's not so many, right? It's not like thousands of people have reanalyzed, the link between vaccines and autism. There's really kind of a handful of groups that have done that. And so we have a higher bar than just kind of, this is what he said, she said. With that said, that's also, I think, a reflection of kind of the literature. There's more supporting. So there's about 94% are mentioning. And mentioning is a big diverse bucket as well that can be broken down into many things. About 5% are supporting, and then less than 1% are contrasting. And I think that reflects the fact of, it's humans behind all these things. And to contrast you, if we're in the same field, you might not like that, and maybe you will look negatively upon my next paper that you're reviewing or my grant review. And so there's social structures and challenges around that. There is a difference that we see across from fields, and I generally show a slide, which I don't have immediately available, breaking this down at the journal level across fields. And so math has a lot of supporting citations, very few contrasting citations, and then as you go from physical, chemical, earth sciences, again, more supporting than contrasting. And then if you look at biomedical or social sciences, there's more of a spread. And I think, it's a healthy thing to have papers supported and contrasted. And I think this is something we'll have to learn and kind of educate the community on, is that, you shouldn't avoid having contrasting citation statements at all costs. And sometimes, people, they have the ability to flag their citations on our system and say, this doesn't look like it's contrasting, it looks like it's mentioning. We often see authors doing that to try to have a perfect, just all supporting. And I think if you think about that longer than 30 seconds, that's not something you'd really want, right? You should be building, changing your opinions, and improving. And so oftentimes, I think some of these biggest papers, have a pretty good mix. And it's interesting to look at what a contrasting citation says or a supporting citation statement, because even within that, type, there can be different degrees, right? I couldn't reproduce this at all is different from, we found 50% less than this, but both would be contrasting in our system.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks a lot. So we're kind of towards the end of our session. So I just want to thank all three of our panelists today for some really excellent discussion and talks. And I would just want to remind the audience that we have a networking session now coming up. So please hop in to link with your peers. So thanks again, and see you in the next sessions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.